Human history is a long journey marked by wars and conflicts that have not only altered the destinies of nations and peoples, but have sometimes also reshaped the global order. Some battles were not merely about victory or defeat on the battlefield. They opened up new eras, forever changing the political map, cultures, and human mindsets. From the fields of ancient Greece, the deserts of the Middle East, to the battlefields of Europe and Asia, history has witnessed wars whose outcomes determined not only winners and losers, but also had a profound impact on the world we live in today. In today's video, adapted from 3 articles titled 10 Battles That Changed Human History, we will explore these decisive battles through the lens of the author, Tadicius, who has identified them as crucial turning points in human history. In addition to these 10 battles with significant impacts, the author also mentions other noteworthy conflicts that, while deserving of recognition, cannot compare in importance to the top 10. If you have grasped the spirit of this video, let's dive into the main content right now. Welcome to Dreamy Nights. The Battle of Gaugamela in 331 BCE was a turning point in history. Prior to this battle, the Persian Empire was the most powerful force in the world, while the Kingdom of Macedonia was relatively small and insignificant. However, this clash marked the beginning of the extraordinary conquest of Alexander the Great. Facing overwhelming odds, only 47,000 Macedonian troops against 200,000 Persian soldiers, Alexander displayed his remarkable military genius, employing tactics that would be studied by generals for centuries. Central to his strategy was the traditional phalanx formation, with soldiers armed with 5-meter-long sarissas in the center, supported by shock cavalry, which made its first historical appearance here. The phalanx broke the Persian infantry lines from the front, while Alexander personally led the Macedonian cavalry in a flank attack that penetrated deep into the Persian center. Terrified by the ferocity of Alexander's forces, the Persian King Darius III fled the battlefield. Witnessing their king's retreat before the battle had even ended, the Persian troops lost morale and abandoned the fight, leading to the collapse of the entire Persian army. The outcome of this battle marked the beginning of the decline and eventual collapse of the ancient Persian Empire, paving the way for Alexander's unparalleled conquest. This victory immortalized Alexander and his Macedonian army in history, with their formidable sarissas and invincible cavalry. Significantly, it was the first time that a small Greek kingdom rose up and conquered one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. This event also marked the dawn of Alexander's empire, stretching from Greece to India, leaving a lasting imprint of Greek civilization across Central Asia. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE marked a decisive turning point in the ancient Mediterranean. For centuries, Rome and Carthage had been the 2 most powerful city-states of their time. During the Second Punic War, the most brutal of the Punic conflicts, 2 of history's greatest generals faced off. Hannibal of Carthage, remembered as Rome's greatest enemy after his legendary victory at Cannae, and Scipio Africanus, a brilliant Roman commander who had defeated the Carthaginian forces in Iberia, opening the path to invade Carthage itself. The Battle of Zama was a clash that would determine the fate of both sides and decide who would dominate the Mediterranean. Hannibal chose Zama as the battlefield to leverage his cavalry and war elephants, but Scipio, having studied elephant charges, trained his soldiers to minimize casualties from these beasts. Moreover, Scipio held a trump card: the Numidian cavalry, former allies of Carthage who were now the world's strongest light cavalry, with exceptional speed and javelin throwing skills. Victory hinged on the Numidian cavalry and Hannibal's war elephants. In the battle, however, the Carthaginian elephants were ineffective, and some even trampled their own troops. Meanwhile, the Carthaginian cavalry was defeated by the combined strength of the Roman and Numidian horsemen, leaving Hannibal's army exposed and surrounded. Hannibal and Carthage suffered a crushing defeat, granting glory to Scipio and Rome, and bringing the Second Punic War to an end with Rome's ultimate triumph. The significance of the battle lay in the fact that Carthage forever lost its power to challenge Rome, leading to its eventual destruction. From that moment, Rome established dominance over the Western Mediterranean, paving the way for the rise of the mighty Roman Empire. The Battle of Chalons in 451 CE was a pivotal moment in European history. Attila the Hun, known as the Scourge of God for his ruthless conquests, had plundered and devastated much of Europe. At this point, Attila aimed to seize all of Western Europe by defeating his opponents at Chalons. Facing him was the Western Roman Empire, the last defender of Western civilization, joined by various Germanic kingdoms and tribes Visigoths, Franks, and Alensunder, the leadership of the brilliant Roman general Flavius Aetius. Realizing that Attila's unchecked advance would spell disaster for Europe, the Romans and their Germanic allies forged a final alliance to oppose the Huns. At the time, no one in Europe could stand against Attila, so he entered the battle supremely confident, despite prophecies foretelling his defeat. The battle took place on the Catalonian plains near modern-day Chalons in northern France. Both sides deployed in 3 wings. On the left, the alliance positioned Roman legions and Frankish warriors to confront the Gepids and the Huns' allies. On the right, Visigoths faced the Ostrogoths, Attila's close allies, and at the center, the Alans met Attila's main force. Attila's center, personally commanded by him, initially overwhelmed the Alans, causing heavy losses. However, on both flanks, the situation was different. The Gepids failed to break through the Roman lines, and the Visigoths decisively defeated the Ostrogoths, threatening the Huns' flanks. Attila had to divert some of his forces to support the Ostrogoths, which prevented the Alans from collapsing. At that moment, the Visigothic king Theodoric was killed, but instead of retreating, the Visigoths were driven by vengeance and shattered the Ostrogoths and Attila's reinforcements, then attacked Attila's central army. The momentum shifted, completely, forcing Attila to retreat for the first time in his life and accept total defeat at Chalons. This was Attila's first significant defeat, and it was the combined strength of the Romans and their Germanic allies that halted his conquest of Europe. The battle taught the Germanic peoples that they could resist the Huns without Rome's help in the future. The victory at Chalons arguably saved European civilization from the devastation of a nomadic Asian invasion, not just politically, but also in terms of culture and religion. The Battle of Yarmouk in the year 636 CE was a turning point in the 7th century, marking the first wave of Islamic expansion. Under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad, and later his successors the Rashidun caliphs, the Muslim armies, after fully conquering the Arabian Peninsula, turned their attention to the Persian lands of the Sasanian Empire and the Holy Lands of Palestine and Syria, which at the time were part of the Byzantine Empire, essentially today's Middle East. Recognizing the threat, Byzantine Emperor Heraclius assembled his army to counter the Muslim forces. In an unprecedented move, a temporary alliance was formed between the longtime enemies Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire to resist the Muslims. Faced with attacks from 2 fronts, the Muslims temporarily made peace with the Sasanians to focus on the Byzantines. In the summer of 636, both sides marched to the plains of Yarmouk, a flat desert ideal for cavalry warfare. This battle would showcase the peak of cavalry tactics in military history. The Byzantine army, numbering an estimated 20,000 to 40,000, or about 100,000 according to ancient records, under General Vahan, launched repeated assaults on the Muslim forces, who numbered around 15,000 to 20,000, or 40,000 according to ancient sources, led by General Khalid ibn al-Walid. Despite days of fierce attacks, the Byzantines could not break through the Muslim lines. Whenever the Muslims were pushed back, they counterattacked with their light and swift cavalry, which could strike at the Byzantine flanks and then retreat, quickly, forcing the Byzantines to pull back repeatedly. After 4 days of inconclusive fighting, and a day without combat on the 5th day, the Muslims launched a massive counterattack on the 6th day, sensing that the Byzantine troops had lost their morale. Concentrating their cavalry on one flank, while the Byzantines maintained their old formations unaware of the shift, the Muslim cavalry charged unexpectedly into the Byzantine left wing, causing it to collapse and spreading panic throughout their lines. Though the Byzantine cavalry regrouped, it was too late. Both the Muslim cavalry and infantry struck at the remaining Byzantine forces, leading to the complete rout of the Byzantine army. The Byzantines fled into narrow ravines where Muslim detachments deployed the day before ambushed them. The battle ended in a decisive Muslim victory, with minimal casualties on their side, while the Byzantines lost nearly half of their initial strength. Strategically, this battle was decisive in that it brought the Holy Lands Palestine and Jerusalem under Muslim control, laying the foundation for Islam's enduring presence there to this day. Following this victory, the Muslims continued to expand, conquering Egypt in 642, destroying the Sasanian Empire in 651, and spreading Islam from North Africa to India, even threatening Constantinople itself. In the year 732, nearly a century after the victory at Yarmouk, Islam had grown into an immensely large religion, whose expansion now directly threatened the existence of Christianity. By the 8th century, under the leadership of the Umayyad caliphs, the Muslim forces began their first steps to conquer Europe, invading the Iberian Peninsula and destroying the Visigothic Christian kingdom there. Their next target was the northern kingdoms of the Franks and Burgundy. At that time, the Muslim army was like an unstoppable whirlwind, with its skilled cavalry posing a nightmare to any European force. All hope rested on Charles Martel, the mayor of the palace of the Carolingian dynasty, and his seasoned northern army. In 732, the Muslim army advanced into what is now northern France, reaching the region of Tours, where Charles Martel's forces awaited them. Realizing it would be suicidal to engage the Muslims in an open battlefield with his smaller army, Martel decided to position his forces on a hill, using the surrounding woods for cover and camouflage, to better resist the Muslim cavalry's charges. The unfavorable terrain and the disciplined Christian infantry effectively repelled all Muslim cavalry assaults, something unimaginable at the time. After days of fruitless attacks, the Muslims grew impatient and prepared for an all-out assault, with their entire force, hoping to break Martel's lines and end the battle. This was precisely what Charles Martel had anticipated. As the Muslim army threw itself against his lines, Martel ordered small groups of his men to attack the now empty Muslim camp, burning their supplies, seizing plunder and slaves. While the Muslims tried in vain to break through the Christian lines, they saw their own camp under attack. Some groups turned back to defend the camp, leading to a disastrous outcome as the main Muslim force, believing the battle was lost, began to flee. That night, the Muslims retreated under cover of darkness, leaving the Christians victorious against all odds. The battle was decisive for the survival of Christianity, halting the Islamic advance into Europe. It was a classic defensive victory, showcasing the effectiveness of infantry tactics and cementing Charles Martel's reputation a foundation upon which his grandson Charlemagne would later build the Carolingian Empire. In the Battle of Vienna in 1683, the Ottoman Empire launched its campaign to capture Europe through the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, opening the gates to Europe for the Ottoman Empire. Within just 200 years, the Ottomans had conquered many territories, defeating the Kingdom of Hungary and pushing towards the Holy Roman Empire of the Habsburgs. The Ottomans' ultimate goal was none other than Vienna, the capital of the Habsburgs, where they had previously failed in 1485. By this time, the Ottoman army had grown much stronger than the earlier Muslim Umayyad dynasty's first European invasions in the 8th century. Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha personally commanded nearly 150,000 Ottoman troops in an assault on Vienna. Emperor Leopold I, upon hearing the news, fled to Passau with 60,000 civilians, and Prince Charles also retreated with 20,000 troops. This left only about 11,000 soldiers and 5,000 militiamen inside Vienna, far fewer than the Ottoman force. Recognizing that Vienna would fall without reinforcements, and that this could be a disaster for all Christian nations in Europe, Pope Innocent the dispatched King John III Sobieski of Poland to lead a combined force of Polish, German, and Austrian troops to save the city. Meanwhile, the Ottomans had begun their siege and assault on Vienna. However, the city's robust fortifications allowed the Austrian defenders to repel repeated Ottoman attacks. One reason the Ottomans failed to capture the city was that Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha wanted to preserve Vienna's wealth intact rather than destroy it during the siege. This hesitation allowed the defenders to hold out, despite suffering heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the Polish king's reinforcements arrived, placing the Ottomans in a dilemma: either withdraw to intercept the relief force or quickly capture the city before the enemy arrived. Ultimately, they chose to continue their assault. From a vantage point, King John III Sobieski saw the Ottomans attacking Vienna and made a bold, decisive move. He ordered his entire cavalry force of 20,000 men to launch a direct attack on the Ottoman lines. This became the largest cavalry charge in history, featuring the famed winged hussars with their angelic wings thundering toward the enemy. Taken by surprise, the Ottomans panicked and retreated from the city. The defenders also sallied forth from within to support the assault. Exhausted from days of fighting, the Ottoman forces broke and fled completely. Vienna was saved, and the Christian coalition army emerged victorious. Strategically, this was a decisive victory that shattered the Ottomans' ambition to conquer Europe and permanently halted the Muslim advance. The Ottomans were forced to sign a peace treaty, preserving Christianity in Europe and paving the way for the Habsburgs to reclaim Hungary and push the Ottomans back to the Balkans. Interestingly, this victory also inspired culinary traditions such as the croissant, shaped like the Ottoman crescent, the twist-shaped kipferl pastry, and even the cappuccino, named after the Capuchin monks and using coffee captured from the Ottomans. The Battle of Trafalgar in 1805 is considered the most significant naval battle in human history. Here, the British Royal Navy faced its two greatest adversaries, the Spanish Navy and the French Navy, at Cape Trafalgar. Initially seen as a strategic, defensive engagement for the British, its outcomes influenced not only the short-term war in Europe, but also shaped the world for centuries to come. Prior to the battle, France had not yet expanded across Europe, but it possessed the strongest land military power in the world. Napoleon's ultimate goal was to invade Britain, eliminating the threat across the English Channel. He made this decision because Britain had never suffered a direct attack from France, allowing them to freely support their allies. The British Navy blockaded French Atlantic ports, while their infantry could attack from behind as the French advanced eastward. To make his plan successful, Napoleon first had to defeat the experienced British Navy, led by the genius Admiral Horatio Nelson. The French Navy formed an alliance with the Spanish Navy, creating a combined fleet to counter the British. The battle unfolded when the Franco-Spanish fleet headed southeast and was detected and shadowed by the British Navy. Allied commander Villeneuve then decided to engage the British fleet at Cape Trafalgar on the Atlantic Ocean, even though he had previously wanted to avoid direct confrontation. The Allies fielded 41 ships, arranged in a traditional line formation, including 4 first-rate ships, some of the largest in the world, especially the Spanish ship Santísima Trinidad with 130 guns, larger than any British vessel. Though the British had only 3 first-rate ships, they also had 4 second-rate ships, an advantage the Allies lacked. This imbalance gave the British a significant edge. Admiral Nelson employed a bold tactic that changed naval history by splitting his fleet into 2 columns and driving them straight at the enemy's line rather than forming a parallel line. One column was led by Vice Admiral Collingwood on HMS Royal Sovereign, while Nelson personally led the other aboard HMS Victory, aiming directly at Villeneuve's flagship Bucentaure. Nelson's strategy was undoubtedly a gamble, but it was a carefully calculated one. That day, the weather was calm, an ominous calm before the storm that slowed the British ships and exposed them to Allied fire, especially the lead ships. HMS Victory even lost its steering wheel to enemy fire. However, as soon as they closed with the enemy, the British ships opened fire and cut the Allied formation into 3 segments. Each British ship, as it passed through the enemy line, could fire from both sides, while the enemy could only return fire from one side, creating a relentless chain of broadsides that left the Allies with no chance to reload and retaliate. While the British maneuvered nimbly, the Franco-Spanish fleet was passive and slow. One by one, The Allied first-rate ships were bombarded and forced to surrender, followed by the smaller ships. The British fleet then regrouped and encircled the remaining enemy ships from behind, completely shattering the Franco-Spanish fleet. The only misfortune for the British was the death of Admiral Nelson, who was mortally wounded, a great loss for the British Navy. Before his death, Nelson left behind his immortal words. The battle itself was the decisive naval victory of the Napoleonic Wars. The British not only destroyed the French and Spanish navies, but also secured their naval dominance for the next 100 years, ushering in the glorious Victorian era of British history. The battle marked the end of the Age of Sail and the beginning of the age of steam-powered ships, an important milestone in human technological progress. Many people claim that the Battle of Waterloo was the battle of the century and marked the end of Napoleon's grand conquest. However, in reality, his empire effectively collapsed after a battle 2 years earlier, the greatest defeat in his illustrious military career, the Battle of Leipzig. In the 19th century, Emperor Napoleon and his Grande Armée nearly forced all of Europe to its knees by conquering Austria and defeating Prussia. However, the disastrous adventure in Russia exacted a heavy price, with over 2/3 of his army destroyed. Enemies everywhere began to counterattack, shaking his empire to its core. In the west, British and Spanish forces invaded France, while in the east, the coalition of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, now joined by Sweden, gradually forced the French army back toward their homeland. Napoleon decided that he must break the advance of the Eastern Coalition to free his hands to confront the British. He concentrated his army at Leipzig to protect crucial supply lines. Before this battle, Napoleon's experienced core army had been almost completely destroyed in Russia, forcing him to recruit inexperienced conscripts, which severely weakened the fighting strength of the French army. Additionally, the French were heavily outnumbered, 190,000 French troops against 430,000 coalition troops. Napoleon's only hope lay in the coalition's loose alliance, which might create opportunities for a French breakthrough. However, the coalition had learned from their past defeats at Austerlitz, Jena, Wagram, and Dresden. On the main battlefield in the southeast, Russian and Austrian forces confronted Napoleon's main army, while the Prussians attacked from the northwest. During the first 2 days of battle, both sides fought fiercely for key positions. The coalition launched repeated attacks on French defensive positions, but suffered heavy losses and failed to achieve any breakthroughs. Meanwhile, the French army, after initially repelling attacks, tried to counterattack, but could not make a decisive impact due to their inferior numbers. Gradually, the battle became a war of attrition, with the advantage shifting toward the numerically superior coalition. The French forces were pushed back and increasingly surrounded. Napoleon launched several large-scale counterattacks, but these only resulted in more French casualties. On the third day, the outcome was decided when the Swedish Crown Prince Bernadotte's forces joined the battle, completing the encirclement of the French army. At this point, the French troops, having suffered heavy losses and hearing of the enemy's reinforcements, began to despair. Some soldiers deserted, surrendered, or even betrayed their comrades. Napoleon, realizing that defeat was inevitable, ordered a retreat from Leipzig at night, heading back toward France. However, a disaster struck during the retreat when the bridge was blown up, while French troops were still crossing it, resulting in many soldiers drowning or being captured. The Battle of Leipzig ended in a catastrophic defeat for the French army, marking the final chapter of Napoleon's great empire. This battle was a decisive victory for the coalition of Russia, Austria, Prussia, and Sweden, and marked the collapse of the French Empire, forcing Napoleon to abdicate for the first time. Compared to Waterloo, this was his most bitter defeat. Against enemies he had previously vanquished with ease, utterly destroying all his hard-won achievements. From then on, France's role as a great power shifted to Prussia and Russia. The victory also held great significance for the German people, as the southern states were completely liberated from French rule, setting the stage for Germany's national unification. The Second Battle of the Marne in 1918 marked the final year of World War I. At that time, the Allies were facing immense difficulties. On the Eastern Front, Russia had withdrawn from the war after the October Revolution. Romania had been defeated and forced to sign the Treaty of Bucharest, and Italy was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, American troops had not yet fully engaged, and the British and French forces were exhausted after 4 years of trench warfare with Germany. Sensing this as a perfect opportunity, the German High Command decided to launch a comprehensive offensive on the Western Front by redeploying over 500,000 troops from the east. This campaign, known as the Spring Offensive of 1918, or sometimes called the Kaiser's Battle, or the Ludendorff Offensive, aimed to defeat the British and French forces before American reinforcements arrived, hoping to secure a favorable armistice. The initial German attacks were devastating, breaking through and overwhelming Allied lines due to the lack of coordination among the Allies. Only after Marshal Ferdinand Foch was appointed Supreme Commander of the Allied forces did the situation improve. Although German troops penetrated deep into enemy territory, they only captured areas of little strategic value and could not establish strong defensive positions, ultimately forcing them to retreat. The German offensives continued for months, compelling the Americans to enter combat earlier than planned. By June, the Germans managed to break through Allied lines and cross the Aisne River, coming within 100 kilometers of Paris. Seeing an opportunity to end the war, Ludendorff concentrated his forces toward Paris, and by July they reached the Marne River, only 40 kilometers from the city. The French government panicked, and General Pétain rushed to reinforce Paris with reserve troops. Meanwhile, the American Expeditionary Force was called into action, providing fresh, unexhausted troops who significantly bolstered the Allied defensive line. Despite these efforts, the Germans remained a formidable force. In the first assault, they quickly shattered the initial Allied defenses and crossed the Marne. However, they could not secure strategic positions, and in the second assault, they encountered stiff resistance from American troops who decisively halted them. The Germans, exhausted from trench warfare and months of continuous fighting, still marching on foot due to the lack of motorized vehicles, were unable to advance. When the Germans were finally stopped, the Allies launched a major counteroffensive. From the north, General Charles Mangin's French 10th Army, known for its aggressive tactics, struck behind German lines, shattering their northern flank and attacking the Central Army under the German Crown Prince Wilhelm. The Germans were caught completely off guard, having believed that the French would not risk withdrawing troops from the Flanders front to defend Paris. Simultaneously, other Allied forces launched supporting attacks, forcing the Germans to retreat from the Marne. Despite attempts to regroup, German morale and strength had collapsed, and they could no longer mount an effective counterattack. By the time they withdrew to the Vesle River, they were completely defeated. The French likened the German defeat to the Battle of Leipzig in 1813, where Napoleon was decisively beaten by a coalition of Austrian, Prussian, and Russian forces, a bitter irony indeed. The Second Battle of the Marne thus marked a turning point, signaling the collapse of the German Empire, much like Napoleon's defeat led to the fall of the French Empire. In terms of significance, the Second Battle of the Marne was the decisive victory of World War I, ensuring the complete defeat of Germany not just in their 1918 offensive, but in the entire war. From this moment on, Germany was in full retreat, and within 3 months, the German emperor abdicated, the Second Reich collapsed, and a new world order began laying the foundation for the world we know today. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943, was an event of such unparalleled horror and brutality that words can scarcely describe it, not only due to its status as the deadliest battle in human history, but also because of the ferocity and uncompromising nature of the fighting between the Soviet Red Army and Nazi Germany, with both sides willing to send their troops to certain death. After defeating France, Germany pivoted east to prepare an attack on its sworn enemy, the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the USSR across its entire western border, an initial phase that proved disastrous for the Red Army as German forces overwhelmed defenses, annihilated vast Soviet formations, and by late 1941 reached the outskirts of Moscow. However, as in Napoleon's invasion nearly 130 years prior, the Russian winter, coupled with reserve troops and Siberian divisions under commanders like General Zhukov, helped save Russia by repelling the Germans from Moscow, thereby foiling Germany's blitzkrieg strategy, though the chance to defeat the Soviets was not yet lost. In 1942, German forces stabilized their fronts and shifted their axis of attack southwards, deploying elite troops towards the Caucasus region, considered the Soviet Union's primary source of food, essential supplies, and oil. The city of Stalingrad was deemed a must-capture objective, not only because it was the largest industrial city in the southern USSR and a vital transit hub for goods from the Caucasus to the north, the capture of which would strangle the northern Soviet regions, but also for its symbolic name. Destroying Stalin's city would be a significant blow to the Soviet supreme leader. The German southern offensive, despite meeting fierce Red Army resistance, largely achieved its initial objectives, and by late July, German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, initiated the assault with relentless air raids that within days reduced the modern industrial city to rubble. The outnumbered Soviet Air Force could offer little resistance, allowing German bombing to inflict massive casualties on both civilians and Soviet troops. Supply lines across the Volga River from the East Bank to the embattled West Bank were heavily interdicted, destroying most transport vessels and stranding vital supplies and personnel. Despite these devastating bombardments intended to break the Red Army's will, German infantry encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance upon entering the city. The German forces, renowned for their mobile tactics and coordinated combined arms operations, found their firepower severely limited in the narrow streets and among the ruins, forcing them to restrict artillery and air support to avoid friendly fire. Understanding this, the Red Army adopted hugging tactics, staying in close proximity to German lines to minimize the enemy's firepower advantage. Obeying Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, not one step back, the Red Army paid an immense price, suffering tens of thousands of casualties, many times greater than German losses, to hold the city. The Soviets mobilized troops from the north to reinforce Stalingrad, accepting heavy losses to ferry them across the Volga. A brutal stalemate ensued as the Germans could not advance further, and the heavily depleted Red Army could not yet launch a major counteroffensive, leading to the failure of the German plan to capture the city before winter. After 3 months of intense attacks, by October 1942, German forces had finally pushed deep into the city, reaching the banks of the Volga River, splitting the Red Army defenders into 2 pockets and capturing approximately 90% of Stalingrad. However, winter had arrived, severely hampering further operations. The Germans were unable to launch decisive attacks to eliminate the remaining Red Army strongholds, partly because some air units had been redeployed to North Africa, and partly due to the exhaustion and heavy losses sustained by their troops. As the German forces became bogged down, the Red Army prepared its counterattack. Ironically, the German success in capturing most of the city and splitting the defenders had drawn their main forces into an urban trap, while their flanks outside, the city were thinly held by less capable Allied troops from Italy, Romania, and Hungary. In mid-November 1942, amidst the harsh winter, 7 Soviet armies, concentrated for the operation, launched a massive pincer movement from the northwest and southeast. Exploiting surprise and overwhelming numerical superiority, Soviet forces rapidly swept aside the Italian and Romanian flank guards, encircling over 300,000 Axis troops within the ruined city of Stalingrad. With their supply lines severed, the combat effectiveness and morale of the trapped German forces plummeted. The German High Command devised plans to break the encirclement, but these were fraught with internal disagreement as Hitler insisted that the forces in Stalingrad hold their ground and await relief, while some generals advocated for an immediate breakout and retreat. Ultimately, the decision was made for the trapped army to remain, partly a forced choice as a retreat from Stalingrad would have left German army groups in the Caucasus isolated. The German forces dug in to await reinforcements, but their situation deteriorated daily. The Luftwaffe was unable to provide adequate supplies of food, medicine, or even winter clothing, and German morale sank to new lows. By December 25, 1942, the battle's outcome was effectively sealed when the Red Army decisively defeated a German armored column attempting to relieve Stalingrad, extinguishing all hope for a breakout. At this point, Hitler and the German High Command understood the battle was lost, yet Hitler still ordered General Paulus, the commander of the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad, to fight to the last man and not surrender, partly to allow other German forces in the south to withdraw and partly to preserve Hitler's prestige and the myth of German invincibility. By the end of January 1943, the situation for the German forces in Stalingrad was utterly desperate. The Red Army captured the last remaining airfield, ending any possibility of evacuation. Facing a hopeless situation, General Paulus decided to surrender to save the lives of his remaining soldiers. All German and Allied troops in the pocket capitulated shortly thereafter. Thus, after more than 8 months of relentless fighting, the bloodiest battle in human history concluded with a decisive and pivotal victory for the Allies in World War II. Though victorious, the Soviet Union suffered immense losses. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded, tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment were destroyed, and the industrial city of Stalingrad was completely devastated. On the Axis side, nearly 1 million soldiers, predominantly German, Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Croatian, were killed or captured. The significance of the Battle of Stalingrad cannot be overstated. It was a decisive victory that marked a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front, and for the entirety of World War II. The Soviet Union transitioned from a defensive posture to a full-scale counteroffensive against German forces, leading to subsequent major engagements like the Battle of Kursk, which further solidified the strategic initiative in Soviet hands and ultimately decided the fate of the war in Europe. This victory, like the defense of Moscow and the defeat of Napoleon, was once again significantly aided by the harsh Russian winter, which proved a formidable ally to the Soviet forces. The Battle of Stalingrad served as a critical springboard for the Soviet Union and the ideology of communism to stand firm, ultimately playing a central role in crushing Nazism and forever altering the course of world history. The Battle of Stalingrad, 1942-1943, was an event of such unparalleled horror and brutality that words can scarcely describe it. Not only due to its status as the deadliest battle in human history, but also because of the ferocity and uncompromising nature of the fighting between the Soviet Red Army and Nazi Germany, with both sides willing to send their troops to certain death. After defeating France, Germany pivoted east to prepare an attack on its sworn enemy, the Soviet Union. In 1941, the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa, invading the USSR across its entire western border, an initial phase that proved disastrous for the Red Army as German forces overwhelmed defenses, annihilated vast Soviet formations, and by late 1941, reached the outskirts of Moscow. However, as in Napoleon's invasion nearly 130 years prior, the Russian winter, coupled with reserve troops and Siberian divisions, helped save Russia by repelling the Germans from Moscow, thereby foiling Germany's blitzkrieg strategy, though the chance to defeat the Soviets was not yet lost. In 1942, German forces stabilized their fronts and shifted their axis of attack southwards, deploying elite troops towards the Caucasus region, considered the Soviet Union's primary source of food, essential supplies, and oil. The city of Stalingrad was deemed a must-capture objective, not only because it was the largest industrial city in the southern USSR and a vital transit hub for goods from the Caucasus to the north, the capture of which would strangle the northern Soviet regions, but also for its symbolic name. Destroying Stalin's city would be a significant blow to the Soviet supreme leader. The German southern offensive, despite meeting fierce Red Army resistance, largely achieved its initial objectives, and by late July, German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, initiated the assault with relentless air raids that, within days, reduced the modern industrial city to rubble. The outnumbered Soviet Air Force could offer little resistance, allowing German bombing to inflict massive casualties on both civilians and Soviet troops. Supply lines across the Volga River from the East Bank to the embattled West Bank were heavily interdicted, destroying most transport vessels and stranding vital supplies and personnel. Despite these devastating bombardments intended to break the Red Army's will, German infantry encountered unexpectedly fierce resistance upon entering the city. The German forces, renowned for their mobile tactics and coordinated combined arms operations, found their firepower severely limited in the narrow streets and among the ruins, forcing them to restrict artillery and air support to avoid friendly fire. Understanding this, the Red Army adopted hugging tactics, staying in close proximity to German lines to minimize the enemy's firepower advantage. Obeying Stalin's infamous Order No. 227, not one step back, the Red Army paid an immense price, suffering tens of thousands of casualties, many times greater than German losses, to hold the city. The Soviets mobilized troops from the north to reinforce Stalingrad, accepting heavy losses to ferry them across the Volga. A brutal stalemate ensued as the Germans could not advance further, and the heavily depleted Red Army could not yet launch a major counteroffensive, leading to the failure of the German plan to capture the city before winter. After 3 months of intense attacks, by October 1942, German forces had finally pushed deep into the city, reaching the banks of the Volga River, splitting the Red Army defenders into 2 pockets, and capturing approximately 90% of Stalingrad. However, winter had arrived, severely hampering further operations. The Germans were unable to launch decisive attacks to eliminate the remaining Red Army strongholds, partly because some air units had been redeployed to North Africa, and partly due to the exhaustion and heavy losses sustained by their troops. As the German forces became bogged down, the Red Army prepared its counterattack. Ironically, the German success in capturing most of the city and splitting the defenders had drawn their main forces into an urban trap, while their flanks outside the city were thinly held by less capable Allied troops from Italy, Romania, and Hungary. In mid-November 1942, amidst the harsh winter, 7 Soviet armies, concentrated for the operation, launched a massive pincer movement from the northwest and southeast. Exploiting surprise and overwhelming numerical superiority, Soviet forces rapidly swept aside the Italian and Romanian flank guards, encircling over 300,000 Axis troops within the ruined city of Stalingrad. With their supply lines severed, the combat effectiveness and morale of the trapped German forces plummeted. The German High Command devised plans to break the encirclement, but these were fraught with internal disagreement, as Hitler insisted that the forces in Stalingrad hold their ground and await relief, while some generals advocated for an immediate breakout and retreat. Ultimately, the decision was made for the trapped army to remain. Partly a forced choice, as a retreat from Stalingrad would have left German army groups in the Caucasus isolated. The German forces dug in to await reinforcements, but their situation deteriorated daily. The Luftwaffe was unable to provide adequate supplies of food, medicine, or even winter clothing, and German morale sank to new lows. By December 25, 1942, the battle's outcome was effectively sealed when the Red Army decisively defeated a German armored column attempting to relieve Stalingrad, extinguishing all hope for a breakout. At this point, Hitler and the German High Command understood the battle was lost, yet Hitler still ordered General Paulus, the commander of the German 6th Army in Stalingrad, to fight to the last man and not surrender, partly to allow other German forces in the south to withdraw, and partly to preserve Hitler's prestige and the myth of German invincibility. By the end of January 1943, the situation for the German forces in Stalingrad was utterly desperate. The Red Army captured the last remaining airfield, ending any possibility of evacuation. Facing a hopeless situation, General Paulus decided to surrender to save the lives of his remaining soldiers. All German and Allied troops in the pocket capitulated shortly thereafter. Thus, after more than 8 months of relentless fighting, the bloodiest battle in human history concluded with a decisive and pivotal victory for the Allies in World War II. Though victorious, the Soviet Union suffered immense losses. Over 1 million soldiers and civilians were killed or wounded. Tens of thousands of pieces of military equipment were destroyed, and the industrial city of Stalingrad was completely devastated. On the Yao Axis side, nearly 1 million soldiers, predominantly German, Italian, Romanian, Hungarian, and Croatian, were killed or captured. The significance of the Battle of Stalingrad cannot be overstated. It was a decisive victory that marked a crucial turning point on the Eastern Front, and for the entirety of World War II. The Soviet Union transitioned from a defensive posture to a full-scale counteroffensive against German forces, leading to subsequent major engagements like the Battle of Kursk, which further solidified the strategic initiative in Soviet hands and ultimately decided the fate of the war in Europe. This victory, like the defense of Moscow and the defeat of Napoleon, was once again significantly aided by the harsh Russian winter, which proved a formidable ally to the Soviet forces. The Battle of Stalingrad served as a critical springboard for the Soviet Union and the ideology of communism to stand firm, ultimately playing a central role in crushing Nazism and forever altering the course of world history. The Battle of Salamis in 480 BC, regarded as a defense of Western civilization and humanity's first major naval battle, pitted the Persian navy of the Achaemenid Empire against the allied Greek city-states led by Athens. The numerically superior Persian fleet hoped to crush the Greek navy in the Salamis Straits and then coordinate with Xerxes' land forces to conquer all of Greece. However, by skillfully exploiting the narrow straits, the Greek forces neutralized Persia's numerical advantage, much like at Thermopylae. But this time it was the Persians who were enveloped by the Greeks. The battle resulted in a comprehensive defeat for the Persian navy, leaving the Greek navy unrivaled and posing a threat to Persian land forces, compelling their eventual retreat. The Battle of Salamis is considered an exemplary showcase of military art, utilizing terrain and achieving victory with inferior numbers. It halted the Achaemenid Persian Empire's invasion of the Greek city-states, and a few years later, the Greeks decisively expelled the Persians at the Battle of Plataea. The Greek victory at Salamis was crucial in protecting Greek civilization, the cornerstone of ancient Western culture, from Eastern invasion. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was Christianity's greatest defeat at the hands of Islam. After more than 1,000 years of existence, the Byzantine Empire stood on the brink of annihilation due to the rise of the Muslim Ottoman Empire, while Western European Catholic nations remained distant due to the Great Schism. The city of Constantinople had long been an impregnable fortress protecting the empire, until the Ottomans developed massive cannons like the 16-ton Dardanelles gun. After years of war, the once mighty Byzantine Empire was reduced to a small territory around the city of Constantinople, surrounded by enemies. Recognizing that the time to destroy the Christian Empire had come, Sultan Mehmed II decided to attack the capital. The Pope and Catholic nations understood that if Constantinople fell, all of Europe would be threatened by Islam, and they decided to gather forces to aid the city. However, Europe was a land of widespread conflict at the time. The Holy Roman Empire was not yet unified under the Habsburgs, and England and France were engaged in the 100 Years' War. The Pope could only summon a few thousand mercenaries from Italy as reinforcements. This force was insufficient to stop the tens of thousands strong Muslim army. The Christian army's only bastion was the walls of Constantinople, but the Ottoman Dardanelles cannons breached them. Finally, after 53 days and nights of fighting, the Muslims captured Constantinople, transforming the former Christian capital into the heart of the Muslim Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine Empire was extinguished after more than 1,000 years. In terms of significance, the fall of Byzantium and Constantinople threw open the gates of Europe to the Muslims. From then until the 19th century, Europe lived in constant fear of this enemy. Simultaneously, the fall of Constantinople led to the European Renaissance, as Byzantine scholars and artists fled to Italy, bringing with them classical knowledge. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 was hailed as a victory of God. A century after capturing Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire had mastered the eastern half of the Mediterranean, defeating rivals like the Republic of Venice. They were now poised to conquer the remaining half to dominate the Mediterranean with a fleet more formidable than any Christian nations. To counter this, a Holy League was formed by the Pope, led by the Habsburg Empire, Spain, Venice, and Italian city-states. They assembled a mixed fleet to match the Muslim naval forces. The Ottomans had more men and ships, especially skilled archers. However, the Christian coalition had a firepower advantage with powerful galleass warships equipped with many heavy cannons. These ships were key to the Christian victory, as they could destroy enemy vessels from a distance, while the Ottomans relied heavily on their archers. The Allied navy consistently withstood enemy attacks, though both sides suffered heavy losses. At the climax of the battle, the Ottoman flagship Sultana, carrying Commander Ali Pasha, was surrounded. Christian forces boarded the ship, killed him, and hoisted his head, causing the Muslim forces to lose all morale. Combined with combat losses, this led to the near-total destruction of the Ottoman navy. The Holy League achieved a resounding victory. In terms of significance, this victory halted the Ottoman Empire's maritime expansion, as their naval forces could never recover to their former strength due to irreparable losses in manpower, even if ships could be replaced. Although the Christian nations won the battle, they could not gain any territory, as the Ottoman army on land remained too strong. This battle also marked the end of the era of oared galleys carrying troops and ushered in the age of cannon-bearing gunboats. The Battle of Saratoga in 1777 was the battle that gave birth to the United States. The 18th century witnessed the rise of a nation whose existence would later dominate the world, America. To achieve independence, the American people had to fight against the world's most powerful army at the time, the British Empire, and the battle that changed the course of that resistance was Saratoga. After the American colonists rebelled in 1775, the British government decided to send its formidable expeditionary force to join the conflict. Initially, with their superior forces, the British won successive victories against the nascent colonial army. However, the Americans then decided to employ guerrilla tactics rather than confronting the British directly, inflicting heavy losses on the enemy. Faced with this perilous situation, the British decided to attack the Saratoga region in New York to divide the colonial army. This battle became a disaster for the British. Although they achieved initial victories, they suffered heavy casualties. Meanwhile, the American forces increasingly concentrated their numbers and surrounded the British. After more than half a month of fighting, the exhausted British army, surrounded and cut off from communication, finally surrendered to the Americans. This was the first time a professional British Imperial Army had surrendered to a colonial army composed largely of farmers. In terms of significance, the battle was the most important turning point in the American Revolutionary War. From then on, the American Army's position was increasingly consolidated. France also directly entered the war, helping to put the British on the defensive, ultimately forcing them to surrender and relinquish this colony. The battle is considered the origin of the final victory that gave birth to modern America, changing the entire world. The Battle of Midway in 1942 was a victory, achieved through risk and decisiveness. If the Battle of Stalingrad was the turning point in the European theater, then the Battle of Midway can be said to be the turning point of the Pacific theater in World War II. In late 1941, the Japanese Navy launched the attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet and officially bringing America into the war. Throughout the period before Midway, the Japanese Navy dominated the seas of the Pacific Rim. However, they wanted to advance further, aiming to control the entire Pacific Ocean by annihilating the U.S. Navy at Midway. The Japanese plotted to turn Midway into a trap to lure American aircraft carriers to their destruction, but they never expected it to become their own grave. In June 1942, the Japanese Navy began its attack on the Midway base. The U.S. Navy, thanks to intelligence, knew Midway was a trap. They decided to use Japan's own trap against them. 3 U.S. aircraft carriers advanced to the area to confront 4 Japanese carriers. The U.S. Navy arrived just as Japanese air raids were underway. The Japanese, exercising caution, decided to wait until their forces were fully assembled before attacking. This allowed the U.S. to strike first. The Americans made a risky and bold decision: to use their entire force of torpedo bombers as a decoy to set up a decisive blow by their dive bombers. The American decoy forces, though sacrificed, completed their mission by distracting the entire Japanese force. The Japanese Air Force and anti-aircraft defenses were too focused on attacking these decoys. Their easy destruction made the Japanese complacent. Just as the Japanese forces were refueling and rearming, the U.S. dive bombers struck. Caught completely by surprise, the Japanese could not react in time as their weapons and equipment were being resupplied. The attack was unbelievably successful. 3 Japanese aircraft carriers were hit by bombs and sank. The sole remaining Japanese carrier was surrounded by the 3 U.S. carriers. Despite its efforts, this carrier could only heavily damage 1 U.S. carrier before being sunk itself. The battle ended with a decisive victory for the U.S. Navy. In terms of significance, this battle was the turning point of the Pacific Theater in World War II. The Japanese Navy lost 4 of its best aircraft carriers and could never recover its former strength. Meanwhile, it can be said that this victory marked the U.S. Navy as the world's most powerful naval force, breaking Japan's dominance in the Pacific. And so, we have journeyed through a series of battles that changed human history.